today I am very happy to introduce Betsy Peabody, who is the founder and executive director of the Puget Sound Restoration Foundation. She is also the president of the Pacific Shellfish Institute. She served on the governor's Blue Ribbon panel on ocean acidification, acidification, and collaborated with NOAA to establish the Kenneth Chu Center for Shellfish Research and Restoration that the Pacific Sound Restoration Fund operates to help restore native shellfish and living organisms. And so welcome, Betsy, and I hope you can tell us a little bit about the Puget Sound Restoration Foundation. I see you have several staff on board with several projects, so maybe we can start by explaining a little bit about what it is and what the people are working on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Janet. So we're really focused on different kinds of habitats and species in Puget Sound that create the sort of marine architecture that supports lots of other species and organisms, but also supports humans through our food and through the materials and the services that are provided. So some of the examples of that are, for instance, native oyster beds. So imagine sort of a layered native oyster bed in an intertidal area, and you can imagine that it provides structure. There's some three-dimensional structure there, and so it provides lots of little spaces for other critters to hide. Oysters are also filter feeders, so they're cleansing the water, they're removing plankton from the water, and then depositing all that good nitrogen on the bottom in a way that supports eelgrass. So that's sort of a structured native oyster bed that's a foundational piece of a healthy estuary. We're also trying to rebuild pinto abalone populations. Pinto abalone are really important in the ecosystem as well, in the sense that they graze rocky reef habitat. They graze those rocks and they clear them for settlement by other species like bull kelp. So they're important for the health of bull kelp forests. And then we're trying to figure out how to restore bull kelp forests and also just how to build partnerships for conservation and recovery. Bull kelp forests, I want you just to imagine what that three-dimensional habitat looks like underwater. And inside that forest are lots of fish and invertebrates that live. But they're not just living in the forest. All those fish that we eat as well are made of kelp. As it moves up through the food chain. And if the fish are made of kelp, we're made of kelp too. So there are many human connections to these types of habitats and species that are incredibly important as foundational species in Puget Sound. So that's some of the work we do, and hopefully that wasn't too long-winded. Janet.
So tell us about some of your specific projects and the people who are running them. Because you're not doing it all, you have people to help you.
Oh my goodness, that's right. We have a really great team of scientists. We've got 16 people on staff. So we have people who are working at the hatchery, the Kenneth K. Chu Center. There are about 5 or 6 people there. We have people, scientists who work on our Olympia oyster and kelp habitat team. We have people who help with special events. So we've got just a whole team that's out there sort of on the tide flats at the hatchery and in the water, literally underwater, because to do bull kelp work, you've got to dive down and to actually plant seed, monitor the forest, monitor all the species that live in the forest. So when we work, we're working all over Puget Sound at, I don't know, maybe 50 different locations. I don't know the exact number, but working on different things in different areas. So for instance, as an example, Olympia Oyster Restoration, we've done a lot of work here in central Puget Sound. And we've worked with the Suquamish tribe on all of those Olympia oyster projects and many other partners and tideland owners. So in Liberty Bay, at the head of Liberty Bay, right there near downtown Poulsbo, we did a 15-acre project last year in 2020 to sort of rebuild oyster settlement habitat. The year before in Sinclair Inlet, we did a 15-acre project. The year before that, we did a 5-acre project in Dyes Inlet at Chico Bay. We've worked for many years in Dogfish Bay near the Keyport Navy facility, in that little beautiful inlet, and in other parts of Liberty Bay. So over 50 acres of native oyster restoration here in the central Puget Sound area. And that has involved spreading shell and also producing seed at our hatchery. And when we spread shell and put it down in a place where there are still remnant populations, the larvae can set on that shell and recolonize those historic areas and build up that complex habitat of oysters and filter feeders. So those are some examples.
So earlier on then, years ago, there were native oysters in those areas, and they've just got over harvested or they've died because people haven't put their oyster shells back in the water, right?
Yeah, so the history there is that historically there were an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 acres of dense Olympia oysters, not just presence of oysters, dense aggregations of oysters, mostly near the heads of inlets. So think head of Liberty Bay, head of Dogfish Bay, head of Totten Inlet, Eld Inlet, all of those finger inlets in Puget Sound, you had these core populations. And what happened was overharvest, as you mentioned, but also some toxic pollution associated with early pulp mills before there were any discharge limits, and also habitat loss, as a result of development in the watershed surrounding these places. If that resulted in sediment coming down, that might bury what previously had been good firm habitat. And then also nutrients that pour into these different bays, they fuel algae. And that algae, if it's not filtered by filter feeders, it settles out onto the bottom and becomes layers of silt that builds up and softens that ground, which makes it less suitable for Olympia oysters to settle out and grow. So lots of different things that cut those oyster beds down. And then, so as of like 2010, they estimated there were only 150 acres of dense native oyster beds left. So we've been trying to build that up. And as of 2020, we've restored 100 acres and we're still going.
Wow, that's wonderful. And so Betsy, do you work with the homeowners? Because I know you have this huge sale that is in June this year. So people who have waterfront property can have their own garden of oyster, I don't want to call them oyster starts, eggs. I don't know what the right word is. So
seed.
So can you please explain about your sale and who you can sell to and how they can grow these oysters?
Wonderful. So we do have this annual seed sale every year, and we make oyster, mussel, and clam seed available to shoreline property owners on Bainbridge Island that want to create a little shellfish garden on their tidelands. And that gives them a chance to grow oysters for their personal consumption or clams. It allows them to sort of see the waters in front of their places as sort of a living system with species that can still feed us. So it also gives them lots of incentives to keep pollution off their property since they're gathering food on their beaches. So making that connection between what they're doing and the health of the waters where they can still gather food. So we have about, probably over 100 shellfish gardeners around Bainbridge Island that grow oysters, mostly Pacific oysters, but sometimes Kumamotos, also clams and mussels. And then we also have a little community shellfish farm on the Bloedel Reserve tidelands. And that's a place where people around the island can become a member in our CSA, and typically that applies to vegetables, but in this case it applies to oysters. So we grow oysters, and people can get a set number of oysters per month during our harvest season as part of their CSA membership. So again, it's just sort of making that connection between people and the waters that surround us. And I think that that's a really important part of sustainable living here on Bainbridge.
It's because I've seen some of they come in kind of mesh bags, but people I know who have done it with oysters have been amazed how fast the oysters have grown. So within a year, you can harvest them.
Yes, and it depends on the species. So Pacific oysters makes for a really good shellfish garden because it is harvestable within a year. And Kumamoto's take longer. Olympia oysters, the native oyster, take much longer. So maybe 5 years before you can harvest your oysters. Mostly people are growing Pacific oysters, and amazingly, they taste different in the different parts of Bainbridge Island where they're being grown. The oysters in Rich Passage have a slightly different taste. It's a very marine, briny system, different than maybe the oysters in Manitou or the oysters in Port Madison. There are different features of these water bodies, different freshwater inputs that impart different flavors to the oysters.
So what do you think is the biggest challenge at the moment to, say, bull kelp? Because I know kelp, I once took a class with you. Kelp is an annual plant, right? And it moves.
It's in some cases, the area where we live, it's annual, but in some places it's perennial. So it sort of depends. Up along the Strait of Juan de Fuca, it's more perennial. But yes, here in places where bull kelp used to exist around Bainbridge Island, that's Rich Pass, Agate Pass, Restoration Point, and at the head of Eagle Harbor. We used to have kelp forests here. We no longer have any kelp forests here. So in those places, you know, there are so many different factors, and we're trying to understand all of the stressors and the contributing factors to the loss of bull kelp in our part of the world. But temperature, rising seawater temperature, is certainly among the factors. Low seed availability might also be a factor. When a kelp bed gets cut back by a lot of different things, over time it can't build itself up. There's not enough seed supplies, so it can't return the next year. It's sort of fallen below a critical mass. So there are water quality concerns, there's potential boat damage. There are a lot of things that contribute, and we need a better understanding of that. So we worked with agencies and partners to co-author Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan that was completed in 2020. And now we are trying to implement those priority actions thanks to some legislative funding that Senator Rolfes helped champion. So really sort of kickstarting some of those conservation and recovery actions, not just here around Bainbridge, but around Puget Sound with various partners.
So do you think that that is your biggest success to date, the kelp restoration, or would you say the oyster, or just general change in the water patterns?
You know, that's an interesting question. And I would say that for kelp, we have not figured that out yet. We don't know yet how to be successful with that restoration practice. And remember, we're also entering a period where seawater is going to be warming more. So we have challenges to bull kelp conservation and recovery. We've probably had more restoration on the ground with Olympia oysters than any of our other species because we've been in it for longer. We've been doing this project since 1999. We're seeing some incredible sort of pilot scale successes with abalone recovery, and have outplanted 30,000 juvenile abalone to date that we've raised in our hatchery. And some of those animals, in fact, are going out today by divers up in the San Juan Islands. And there's been good survival at some of those sites, and we're trying to rebuild breeding densities. So there are enough abalone close enough together that they can successfully reproduce in a place. But we need to figure out how to take that up in scale. Starting a hatchery where we can do research and restoration has been a success, a big success of ours, and a really important partnership. And then also we've worked really hard in shellfish growing areas around Puget Sound to restore clean water and thereby restore shellfish harvest. So that's been one of our bigger successes, restoring over 1,000 acres of shellfish growing areas to harvest.
And is that commercially or just for people's own use?
It's tribal, commercial, recreational. When you restore clean water in a shellfish growing area, you are potentially enabling all of those things. So we're doing it for all those reasons.
So the local commercial oyster growers must love you, because you have probably enabled them to spread, to increase their yield.
You know, we work in close partnership with a lot of growers all over Puget Sound, and we obviously share a goal of clean water that supports strong growth and multiple species and humans in all these communities. Mm-hmm. So for sure, they also have incredibly important knowledge about how to grow oysters, where to find Olympia oysters, what is the right habitat. So they've carried that knowledge along with the tribes, and they've shared it with us so that we've been able to restore Olympia oysters and build on that knowledge. So they've been really important partnerships.
So the abalone that you're trying to seed, will that eventually become food too? Will you be able to, will they be able to eat that?
Great question.
A delicacy. I've never eaten abalone, so
yeah, they're fantastic. But I think that realistically, probably the Pinto Abalone Recovery Plan or sort of program is going to be a 40-year effort, 50-year effort. Not really sure how far out that goes, but the fishery, there was never a commercial fishery. To be clear, but there was a sport fishery, and the sport fishery closed in 1994 because the population had dropped dramatically. And the belief was that once you remove that harvest pressure, the abalone populations would rebound, but that did not happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because through overharvest and poaching, we had taken the population down to a point where they could not successfully fertilize. Those male and female gametes couldn't meet in the water. And so now we've got to build those densities. It's a long process. You have to do it carefully. We have to grow them in a hatchery, feed them, tend them for a year before we can outplant them. And you have to do it in a way that's genetically responsible, and you have to be outplanting animals that are disease-free. So there's just a lot that goes into it, and we've really been able to increase the numbers that we can outplant, but it's going to take many years, and there will never be a commercial fishery, probably, but maybe someday there will be a sport fishery again. And I'm hopeful that we can be successful, and that'll be possible decades down the road, maybe.
So what is your biggest concern at the moment for things that could go wrong? And I know that the temperature of the seawater is one of them, but what else are you concerned that could be a really deteriorating factor in the sound at the moment?
Well, there's also increasingly corrosive water as a result of carbon emissions, carbon dioxide that are being absorbed into seawater. So 30% of carbon emissions in the atmosphere are absorbed by oceans. And for a long time, people thought, phew, thank goodness for oceans. They're taking some of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for us. But it causes a chemical change that increases the corrosiveness of the water and makes it hard for shell building organisms to build their shell. And there are a lot of calcifying species in Puget Sound. So as the water becomes more acidic and as calcium carbonate that's used to build their shell becomes less available as a result of those chemical reactions that occur when CO2 is absorbed in seawater, our waters become less hospitable for many of the species that have been here for millennia. So we have to figure out what we can do in specific areas to sweeten the water or to reduce the pollution, whether that's from nutrient pollution entering these bays that exacerbate those water quality problems, or from carbon emissions that continue to be absorbed. Reducing those pollution inputs is really critical for maintaining the health of oceans that support all of us and all the other wonderful species.
Yes, my son-in-law is in charge of the project that the city of Seattle is doing under with the feds to control the amount of water that goes into the sound through sewage and water runoff. And so he was in charge of naming the new drill that became Mudhoney. But he is very carefully watching that. So yes, I can see that because the pictures of before it happened, as all this silt goes out into the bay, it's quite heavy. It must present quite a heavy layer that just, it's like 9 inches of soil cuts off all the weeds. All
exactly. Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes it hard, for instance, for kelp forests, because if you have cloudy water, kelps are not going to be able to photosynthesize the way they usually do. It creates a huge burden. But it's incredible that your son is working on that, and I'll have to talk to you about that later because that whole Puget Sound nutrient reduction is going to be a big deal over the next 10 years to reduce those inputs. And hopefully that will have a significant benefit on the receiving waters, making those investments in that kind of infrastructure that really matters when it comes to maintaining the health of Puget Sound.
Yes, so I'll get you in touch when he next comes over. Maybe you could come over for coffee. But is there
Perfect.
anybody else who has a question that they would like to ask? Betsy?
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, I have a question. And that is, I like to walk along the waterfront in Poulsbo. So is there a way you could tell us how we could see what you've done in terms of, I've forgotten the number, but it's a big number. So,
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so if you go to Waterfront Park, and on the north side of Waterfront Park, right there in Silverdale, so north of the pavilion area, there's a staircase that goes down to the tide flat. Okay. And it's sort of off that main parking lot. Go down the staircase and time it with the tide, okay? Because you'll want to have like a zero tidal level, or even like a -1 tidal level would be really good. And if you look right across that head of the bay over to the other side, you should be able to see some emergent shell that's been spread within a 15-acre plot. Yeah. And I'd be happy to go over there with you sometime on a good tide, because I'd love to see it from that shore as well. But that's the best place to view it.
Okay, I just can't visualize it.
Yeah.
Until I can actually visualize it.
Yeah. Like visualize an underlayer, sort of a base layer of larger Pacific oyster shell, and then imagine larvae of native oysters attaching to that, and therefore building up that living veneer of oysters on top of it.
But were the larvae released separately, and now they're glomming on, or did they come along where do they enter the picture?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, historically, there were lots of native oysters in Liberty Bay, and we have done seeding projects elsewhere in Liberty Bay back in the early 2000s. But now the population has built up over time, and there are enough of them such that they spawn regularly,
Oh,
maybe not annually, but regularly. And then their larvae floats around and finds a
yeah.
good place to spot. Yeah. And so where there's oyster shell, that oyster shell is sending out like a chemical signal saying, good place to settle. And when there are live oysters, you get an even bigger signal, like a big neon sign. Oysters live here. And that's a signal for the larvae to settle in that place.
Come on in, right. Do
Come on
drop in, as they say, right?
Right. If
Yeah.
you build it, they will come. It's that kind of concept, but you have to do that in a place where there are healthy enough remnant populations that you do get that larval, that natural larval supply.
Okay, so then it's sustainable for, right. Okay,
Right.
okay, thank you. And I have to run now, but thank you. This was wonderful.
Bye, Nancy.
Bye. Sheila, you
Yeah,
have
I would like to go with you too, Betsy, to see where this place is.
yes, that's me too.
Yeah, okay, let's plan it.
I really would like to do that, but my question really had to do with the spit coming out of Eagle Harbor, out of Wind Point. That spit that goes out there, and that wonderful kelp bed there, I guess. Anyway, it was there before. And the iridescent blues and the greens, the colors on that kelp is absolutely amazing. Is it still there? Actually, it is still there, because when I went out on the ferry yesterday, you could see it sprouting up above the water. So is that a regular forest or what?
Well, that particular spit is Tyee Shoal. And at Tyee Shoal, there actually used to be a bull kelp bed as well. The kelp that you're seeing now is the understory kelp. So imagine the ferns in a terrestrial forest. And the other understory plants. So they're the kelps that have short little stipes or stems. And so they're growing close to the bottom with their big blades that can extend up, 4 or 5 feet. But the bull kelp is the canopy, was the canopy material, like a tree, okay, that existed in that place. And we had been monitoring and doing sort of scientific monitoring there for many years. And in 2015, that bull kelp forest just didn't come back. It didn't sprout there in the spring and grow as it had so many years before. So that canopy part of the forest disappeared. And that was the last bull kelp forest around Bainbridge Island. And so now we've got to figure out how to bring them back. And that's kind of the R&D work that we're trying to do now. And we're working with the Suquamish tribe and NOAA, kind of close to Bainbridge Island. There's a place near Indianola that's called Jefferson Head. And the Suquamish name for that is Doquigwitz. And so we have an enhancement site there, and we've outplanted bull kelp seed last year and this year. The kelp grew to the surface and released its spores into the water. And now we're watching to see if those kelp plants sprout again this year. And we also planted a bunch more seeds so that we could try to hit the magnitude, the right magnitude that could help regenerate that kelp forest. So we're kind of still in the kitchen trying to figure this out.
But you weren't able to plant the seeds down on the one on Eagle Harbor?
We haven't yet, because we're testing we're working out our techniques and methods, and then hopefully we'll be able to work in other places around Bainbridge Island, including that place that you're talking about. So, we can be at this for many years to come, because there's plenty of work.
Was it because of the creosote that killed that off?
Well, I don't know that I could draw a direct line between those two things, because remember that bull kelp forests that used to exist along Rich Pass and Agate Pass and Restoration Point, they too disappeared, and they're not close to creosote. So there are lots of different things going on. And you know, the legislative funding that came out of this last session will help us drill into some of that work in terms of doing environmental monitoring and looking at specific parameters that might be having an effect on whether kelp can be sustained or whether it disappeared. And the three biggies for bull kelp, just so you know, are high current. So there's high flow, they thrive in those areas, high nutrients, because this is a plant or sort of a plant. And then also good substrate on which to attach, and low seawater temperatures, cold water, high flow, high nutrients, good substrate. You know, that's going to make for good conditions. You have those good conditions in Rich Pass and Agate Pass and Restoration Point. So why aren't they there? We've got to figure that out and see whether it's possible to bring them back.
I just want you to know, though, that I so appreciate the beautiful colors of the blades.
Absolutely. Those understory species are amazing. I agree.
So is that why you chose Jefferson Head to do this project? Because that had all the three things that you're talking about, as opposed to down in Wing Point, because the water really does flow strongly through Agate Passage there.
Yeah, the reason we chose Jefferson Head, Doquigwitz, is actually because probably back in 2009, 2010, we were working with Chairman Leonard Forsman of the Suquamish tribe on some things, and they've been partners of ours on Olympia Oyster Restoration since the beginning of PSRF. But Chairman Forsman said, you should try to figure out how to restore a bull kelp forest off Jefferson Head, because I used to fish there with my dad, and there was a really healthy kelp forest there. We used to catch lots of fish. The kelp disappeared in the 80s and 90s, and you should try to figure out how to bring it back. And so, lo, these 10 years later, we're still trying to bring it back. And we were happy to plant kelp last year and happy for it to come to the surface. And Chairman Forsman was there with us, meeting in a boat during the pandemic, separate boats, everyone masked, looking at the kelp that had reached the surface of the water for the first time since the early 90s. So awesome. We've got to build on that, keep it up, and hopefully we can then start to work in other areas as well, where the conditions are right for sustaining kelp forests.
Colleen, do you have a question?
I do. So about 10, 15 years ago, Karen Rohrbach was doing some work with the restoration, Puget Sound, and came down. I wanted to seed a beach down in front of my house, and she was a little, she didn't think it would work, and indeed it did not, because I face east I'm at Yomalt, between Wing Point and Morgan Cove, and we just have too much water movement down here, and so it didn't work. And so I just was wondering, is there any hope?
You know, it is harder to maintain those mesh bags in a high energy shoreline where there's a lot of jostling, and that can kind of uproot the bag, and sometimes it can result in the bag getting buried by sediment. So it was Morgan, I think Morgan.
It was Morgan.
Who came to your beach. Yeah. And I mean, I'm not going to say give up, Colleen, but that is a more challenging spot. And so, you know, if you want that local oyster experience, you can always come out and harvest with us at the Port Madison Community Shellfish Farm off the Blodell Reserve tidelands, where the bags, we have been able to retain and manage bags full of oyster seed. So that's an opportunity if you want to join an eclectic band of volunteer shellfish harvesters when we go out and play around in the mud. So just let me know if you want me to get you connected with that.
Thank you. Do you also, I'd like to know your website, and I'd like to know where when you have your sale, where your sale is.
Okay. The website is www.restorationfund.org. And then you tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, good. Reed Price just put it up there. Awesome. Thanks, Reed. And then the date of the seed sale is June 26th, 8 to 11. And we provide that seed, we distribute that seed at our office, which is located at 8001 Day Road West. It's that rectangular property between Day Road West and Miller Bay, where the Yoga Man sculpture is, kind of behind there in Don Roos's building.
Oh,
we're on the second floor of Don Roos's building.
Thank you.
And do you have to pre-order, Betsy? You can't just turn up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Nancy. I mean, excuse me, Janet. Yes, you have to pre-order, and the order forms are on our website, and you have to pre-order by June 10th. I think that's the deadline.
Okay.
Reed?
Yeah, so one of the things that Colleen mentioned raised this question for me. If you have access or are part owner or whatever, or a waterfront homeowner, are there ways that the Restoration Fund reaches out to you? Or are there things that are particularly in your scope that you might be able to do to help as a landowner adjacent to waterfront?
You know, there are, I mean, so many things that you can do as a landowner adjacent to waterfront, you know, just in terms of, you know, helping to manage those pollution inputs that, you know, affect the species and habitats we're trying to restore. But I would also say that there are places around Bainbridge Island embayments, such as Port Madison, Fletcher Bay, and Manzanita. And in these places, there are remnant Olympia oysters and small aggregations of Olympia oysters in all of these places. And so searching for them, right? Going on a bit of a treasure hunt to see whether or not you have those treasured oysters on your tidelands, and kind of developing that search image is a really fun thing to do, because they're very cryptic. They're small oysters. They're hard to see in the muck of a tide flat. But if you're closer to the heads of those places, or in Fletcher Bay near the gravel bar, there's kind of a nice gravel bar in the middle of Fletcher Bay. These are places that have good conditions that support Olympia oysters today. And, you know, maybe there's a way for us to do, you know, work there in the future to try to build those populations up. And we hope to be working with shellfish gardeners in those places who might be interested in growing out Olympia oysters so that they would release larvae into the water. But you have to be located in those places where the conditions are right for Olympia oysters. Also, just continuing, there are no abalone, pinto abalone around Bainbridge. Okay, those are critters that you find up in the high energy rocky reef parts of Puget Sound. So think coast, Strait of Juan de Fuca, San Juan Islands. And bull kelp, you know, if we can keep our waters clear to support photosynthesis, that will help maintain species that are important, including eelgrass and kelps. And so just kind of being mindful of everything that the marine system does for us and finding ways to reduce our own impact is just a great thing to do.
One of the things that's always bothered me is watching, when I lived on Manitou Beach, was watching the Indians come in with their hoses to dig up gooey ducks. You know, they used to shoot high pressure water. It used to really upset me that they could harvest gooey ducks that way. Are they still allowed to do that? And
well, it's the state, so it's Department of Natural Resources that auctions off tracts of subtidal ground, and different people, entities bid for those tracts to harvest on those tracts, and tribes are doing some of that subtidal harvest, but there are other commercial operations that are harvesting on those subtidal DNR bedlands as well. And the resource is managed so that no more than, I think, 2.3% of the total gooey duck biomass in Puget Sound is opened up to harvest in any given year. And then they let those tracts recolonize over a 30, 40, 50 year period to allow those gooey ducks to come back. So gooey ducks, I think they're one of, I think they account for the largest biomass in Puget Sound. I may be wrong about that. There are lots and lots of gooey duck in Puget Sound filtering away down there in the deeps. And some of those gooey ducks live to be 150 years old, sometimes older. I mean, they're an incredible species. But that particular fishery is being managed by the Department of Natural Resources to limit the harvest and to ensure that those bedlands are coming back and the population is returning to those places.
so it was just one of those years that they were allowed to do it that I saw
In
them
that
doing.
place.
Yes,
in
and
that
then they
place.
move on.
Mhm.
Now, I understand out at Pike Place Market, for example, they're not selling gooey ducks anymore because they're too expensive or too hard to get or whatever.
Well, that's interesting. You know, I'll have to look next time I go to the market. There are people who sell gooey ducks. So I think if you go to the Suquamish Seafood Market, you might be able to buy gooey ducks there. Maybe Central Market every now and then sells gooey ducks as well. I think people at the farmers market on Bainbridge over the years have sold there, but I'm not sure that they're doing that any longer. So gooey ducks are available and they are expensive. And it's an incredible meat, shellfish meat. It's a clean meat and it's highly prized and therefore valuable on the market. And but you can do a lot with, you know, different parts of the animal. And so you can get a lot out of that expensive meat, clean tasting meat. But yes, Sheila, it's not something many of us can buy.
If there's so many of them, why is it so expensive?
Well, maybe because the harvest of them is an expensive undertaking. Think about boats, think about divers, think about air supply, think about safety, think about the whole supply chain and sort of distribution of those gooey duck through the market. There's a lot that goes into that. And that makes it an expensive seafood.
Aren't they prized in Asia?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Japan really uses them. Just a little side note to that. I have some good friends here on the island that every year they have a big family outing to go to get gooey ducks, and from the little kids on up. Every year they've done it for many, many years, and then they usually have a big clam chowder feed for the family, and they love doing that. So
Yeah, I do that with my family too, and it's a part of our tradition, and it is pretty humbling to go out there in search of an invertebrate and to be bested by the invertebrate, right? To not get the gooey duck. And north of where you are, around Manitou, there are quite a few gooey ducks out there on that sand, that broad sand flat.
Yeah.
So there are lots of places around Bainbridge where intertidally you can see gooey ducks and harvest them if the water quality is good. But yeah, they're tricky. They're tricky to get.
Yes, you have to have a special machine container to find them. They are.
Yeah, people use those same types of things that they use with razor clams out on the coast. Those, or sometimes, you know, people are more traditional about it and they just use shovels. And sometimes, you know, kids are putting their whole bodies into those holes. I mean, it's like, you know, a full-on all-day kind of adventure.
Yeah.
In search of the gooey duck.
Yes. Well, thank you, Betsy. If there are no more questions, I want to really say I appreciate you coming today, and we've all learned something. And so thank you. I appreciate it.